The internet is a vital resource that can put people in touch with others from around the world, or research almost any topic they can imagine. It's a tool that's been used to solve countless mysteries, from historical unsolved cases to more recent criminal activity. In March of 2014, 69-year-old retired bank manager Uday Raj Singh was fatally attacked by a gang during the attempted sale of an antique gold and diamond necklace. Despite his wife, Sushila's warnings, Uday invited 6 men who looked like criminals into their Indian home. The men attacked the couple with a bladed weapon after the necklace was brought out. Sushila's screams alerted neighbors and police who were nearby. Most of the 7-man gang, including a lookout, were quickly captured, but Uday had already passed away. One of the ringleaders was 27-year-old MBA graduate Madhu, who was deeply in debt from a failing finance business and saw the necklace advertised online as a way out. Madhu and his accomplices were released on bail in 2017 while awaiting trial, but Madhu disappeared and the case went cold after leads dried up. The investigation restarted in 2022 after the sister of one of Madhu's convicted accomplices pressured police to resume the search. Police tracked Madhu's girlfriend's Facebook page, discovering he was living under a false name in a neighboring city and worked at a bank. A selfie the girlfriend posted with Madhu at a mall led police to monitor her. In May of 2022, 5 years after his disappearance, Madhu was finally apprehended and later sentenced to life in prison. On the 20th of December, 1983, 20-year-old Ellen Gilmore had just finished work in Yorkville, Toronto, and she headed home to her apartment. But she was planning to go out that night and had arranged for her boyfriend Andrew Monk to pick her up. When Monk arrived, he got no answer at the door, and when he walked inside, he was horrified by what he discovered. In Erin's bedroom, he found her deceased in her bed and noted that she'd been tied up and gagged. He performed CPR in hopes that he could revive her, but to no avail. He then called the police, who established that Erin had been attacked with a blade, but the resulting investigation failed to provide them with any helpful leads. But it was apparent that she'd put up a brave fight against her attacker. Monk was suspected at first, but his bank records showed that he was using an ATM at the time of the attack. Unbeknownst to investigators, Erin had been attacked by the same person who ended the life of 45-year-old Susan Tyce, a mother of 4 months earlier. At the time, Susan, who was employed as a therapist, was in the midst of a difficult divorce, but she was known to be strong and independent, and her family felt that she was making the right decision. She was supposed to attend a family dinner in Toronto one night, but failed to show up, and so her brother-in-law traveled to her apartment to see where she was. He found the apartment's back door ajar, and just like in Erin's case, found Susan deceased in her bed. She'd also been attacked with a blade, but despite the striking similarities in the two cases, and the fact that the crimes were committed just a few miles from each other, the police failed to realize that the cases were connected. As was to be expected, Susan's husband was named as the first suspect, but he was eventually cleared of any wrongdoing. Throughout the years, the two cases were revisited, but still, the connection between the two crime scenes went unnoticed, and no suspects were identified. Then, in 2018, investigative genetic genealogy came to the fore as a new way of solving cold cases. After it proved successful in identifying the Golden State Killer, investigators decided to apply the technique to Erin and Susan's cases. The DNA that had been collected from each of the sites was sent to a lab for analysis, and it was determined that the culprit had 4 brothers. Each of the brothers was tracked down, questioned, and eliminated as a suspect, save one man named Joseph Sutherland, who was living in Ontario. They discovered that when the crimes were committed, he'd been living in Toronto, and they confronted him at his house. He willingly gave a DNA sample, which was then sent for testing, but this had clearly unnerved Sutherland, who decided to come clean before the results were returned. He spoke to a friend called Coda and admitted that he'd broken into Susan's apartment looking for valuables to steal. While he was searching the apartment, she appeared out of her bedroom, and he felt he had no choice but to end her life or be arrested. The same scenario played out in Erin's apartment a few months later. Dakota managed to convince Sutherland to hand himself over to the police. He pleaded guilty to his crimes and was sentenced to life in prison with the possibility of parole after 21 years. One of the weirdest mysteries that's been partially solved by the internet is a mathematical problem that's been puzzling experts for years. What made this solution even stranger is where exactly on the internet it was found. Superpermutations are an interesting piece of mathematics. A permutation is a way in which a set of items can be arranged. For example, the permutations for A and B are AB and BA. A superpermutation is then a string of every possible permutation of a set of items. The superpermutation for A and B can be written as ABBA, combining the two permutations together. But there's a shorter way of doing this. ABA includes every permutation, with the B being used for both the first and second permutation. The superpermutation for a set of two items is relatively simple, but things get complicated quickly with larger sets. The number of permutations increases exponentially, which means the superpermutation can get very long very fast. For a long time, mathematicians believed they had a formula which would calculate the length of a superpermutation for any given set. The formula used factorials, represented in mathematical notation with an exclamation point. 1 factorial plus 2 factorial plus 3 factorial up until n factorial, with n being the total number of items in a set, would produce the shortest possible superpermutation. For a set of 5 objects, that would be 1 plus 2 plus 6 plus 24 plus 120, which is 153. But in 2014, a study proved that the algorithm didn't work for sets of items larger than 5. The study found a superpermutation for 6 items that was 1 shorter than the algorithm suggested. This meant that the important mathematical problem was a mystery once again. Researchers got to work to try to solve this puzzle, and it was found that the breakdown wasn't just for n equals 6, but for any higher number. These superpermutations could be found through various other means, such as the traveling salesman thought experiment, or simply through computers checking all the options. But while estimates for a new formula could be made, it wasn't possible to find anything more concrete. In 2018, mathematician Robin Houston stumbled across a blog post which seemed to partially solve the mystery, and Houston was the first person to have proven the original algorithm incorrect, and had been searching online for posts about superpermutations. The blog post was from 2013, back when it was believed the mystery was solved. It was about a solution to a problem posted by an anonymous user on a 4chan board dedicated to anime. The user was discussing the anime The Melancholy of Haruhi Suzumiya, which deals with time travel. Episodes in the first 14-episode season were broadcast in non-chronological order, and that order was changed in later rebroadcasts and home releases. Users were discussing the best way to watch the first season, and someone asked how many episodes they would have to watch the season in every possible order. Given how many possible permutations there are for a set of 14 items, a superpermutation would obviously be huge. But shortly after the original question, another anonymous user posted an answer. They provided a proof, which when converted to mathematical notation would read as n exclamation point, plus n-1 exclamation point, plus n-2 exclamation point, plus n-3. Years later, when mathematicians rediscovered the post, they realized this was the best estimate they had for a lower bound for the superpermutation problem. The proof all seemed correct, and while they couldn't be certain this would definitely be the correct solution, they knew the superpermutation couldn't be any shorter than this. A science fiction author and amateur mathematician came up with the upper bound, which is almost the exact same as the equation for the lower bound, but with an additional n-3 exclamation point. In answering the 4chan user's question, it would take about 4 million years to watch every possible permutation of Haruhi Suzumiya. In the meantime, mathematicians are still trying to figure out if they can get the formula for the upper and lower bounds of the solution to close, finally solving the mathematical mystery for good. The perplexing case involving 42-year-old Anthony Bird started on the 6th of June 1980, after he was reported as missing. His friends would tell investigators that they last saw him on the night of the 3rd of June that year in Queensway, London, before he'd set off in pursuit of another man who he found attractive. This was not out of character for Anthony, as he was known to invite men up to his apartment on a regular basis. He usually met a lot of people while working as a barman and porter at the Railway Tap Pub, and so he had a very active social life. But he failed to show up for his shift the next day, and the police were asked to conduct a welfare check at his apartment. They got no answer at his door, and so they decided to break it down to gain entry. When they made it inside, they found the apartment in disarray, and in his bedroom, Anthony was found deceased. His left wrist and left ankle were bound with tape, and bruises on his body suggested that he'd been assaulted. It was speculated that 2 planks of wood were found nearby and were used by his attacker as a weapon, and they contained fingerprints that could not be matched to anyone in the police's database. Further investigation was carried out, but since Anthony's friends could not describe the man that he was seen with that night, other than the fact that he was African American, the case soon went cold, as no further evidence could be found. No one had seen the 2 men enter the apartment that night, and Anthony's neighbors didn't hear the apparent struggle that had taken place. It was hoped that the fingerprints that had been collected would be matched to the culprit one day, and so the police had no choice but to wait and see if this would happen. The case eventually came to a close when the man in question decided to confess. John Paul, who in 2021 was 61 years old, walked into the Hammersmith police station and stated he needed to speak to someone about a cold case that was 4 decades old. He was taken to an interview room where he confessed to ending Anthony's life and provided the details of that night's events. After his confession, he was sentenced to life in prison and will serve at least 19 years before becoming eligible for parole. Paul Murdaugh, like many young men, shared his life via Snapchat, and tragically, a video shared on the night of June 7th, 2021, minutes before he and his mother Maggie were violently attacked, captured the voice of the person later found responsible, Paul's father, Alex Murdaugh. Alex Murdaugh came from a prominent legal family in South Carolina. Despite an outwardly successful life as a lawyer, he was secretly struggling with prescription drug issues and had been stealing large sums of money from his firm and clients for years. The financial crimes were uncovered earlier on the day of the murders. Alex, Paul, and Maggie were at the family's hunting estate. Maggie, who was hesitant to go, was encouraged by a friend. Alex claimed he left that evening to visit with his mother, with Alzheimer's. Upon returning, he reported finding the bodies of Paul and Maggie, who'd been shot with 2 different weapons near the kennels. Police determined the attack occurred at 8:48:59 p.m., the moment of Paul's last phone activity. Murdaugh called 911 an hour later at 10:07 p.m. Paul's Snapchat, recorded 5 minutes before the attack, placed Alex, Maggie, and Paul at the kennels just before the time of death, contradicting Alex's account of visiting his mother. In court, Alex claimed he was napping, having lied to the police due to paranoia from his pain medication. But this failed to explain why he didn't hear the gunshots. Another Snapchat video recorded earlier that day showed Murdaugh in a different outfit than the clean clothes he was wearing in police body cam footage, despite claiming to have touched the bodies to check for a pulse. Paul's Snapchat videos were crucial evidence. Murdaugh was eventually charged, found guilty by a jury, and sentenced to life in prison for the murders of his wife and son. As children, most of us watch movies with criminals that pull off daring heists, and we wonder what it would be like to pull off such a daring feat. Most of us would never dream of going through with the crime, but one man, Ted Conrad, told his friends from an early age that he was certain he could get away with a bank robbery. His obsession with bank robberies started when he found out that his father, U.S. Marshal John Elliott, was one of the investigators on a case that occurred in 1969, when someone managed to steal $125,000 from the Society National Bank. He then became obsessed with the film The Thomas Crown Affair, in which the leading character, a bored millionaire, decides to add a little excitement to his life by carrying out a heist. It's believed that his belief that he could rob a bank was only heightened when he landed a job at the Society National Bank in Public Square, Cleveland, where he worked as a teller in the bank's cash vault. This position required him to package money that was to be sent to other branches around the country, and so he knew he merely had to find a way to be left alone in the vault so that he could enact his plan. This was strictly against the bank's policy, but on the 11th of July, 1969, he told the only colleague who was working in the vault with him that he could go home early, and against his better judgment, the man decided to leave. Conrad proceeded to take as much of the cash as he could carry and left the bank with about $215,000, which would be worth about an estimated $1.7 million today. He somehow managed to make it out of the building and then inexplicably vanished as if into thin air. After the robbery was discovered, his friends and family were questioned and they searched for him, but he could not be tracked down. Unbeknownst to the police, Conrad had relocated to Boston, where he assumed the name Thomas Randell. With his newfound fortune, he created a new personality and started a new life without informing anyone he knew of where he was. He started a family, started working as a car salesman, and quickly made friends in the area thanks to his friendly disposition. He also started playing golf, and before long advanced to the professional level. To those around him, he seemed to be a regular man who was living a good life with his family, and he was never suspected of being a bank robber, even by his own wife or children. But by 2021, he was diagnosed with lung cancer, and after more than 50 years on the run, he decided to confess. He told his wife of the robbery, and after he passed away, investigators came across his obituary, which listed Conrad's real parents. It also named the college he attended, his mother's maiden name, and his signature, which was strikingly similar to the one that he used while still employed at the bank. It became ever more evident that Conrad was the man that investigators were looking for, and that he'd somehow managed to fool everyone he knew for several decades. They traveled to his Boston home, and there, his wife told them about his confession. But it would come to light that he'd already confessed to the robbery in 1969. He'd written a letter to his girlfriend in which he detailed the crime, but she decided to keep his secret. Sometimes all the information needed to solve a mystery is already out there on the internet. It just takes a dedicated person searching for the right keywords to put all the pieces together. That was the case when a teacher, researching local history, stumbled across a centuries-old mystery in rural Japan. Nick Russell is a British teacher living on Taba Island in Japan. Not long after he moved to the island, he decided to do a little research into the local history and searched foreign ships online. The search turned up results about a mysterious ship that had been spotted off the coast of the island in 1830. The story came from the account of a samurai who was instructed to write about the investigation into the ship. At this point in history, Japan had been closed off to the outside world for about 200 years. The shogun in charge had given strict instructions that any foreign ship trying to make land should be fired upon, and any sailors who might come ashore should be captured or have their lives taken. When the mystery foreign ship appeared, the samurai commanders didn't open fire straight away. The writer was sent to investigate the ship, disguised as a fisherman. He reported back about a group of sailors who didn't seem to be hungry, but were clearly foreign. As more samurai were sent to investigate, a clearer picture of the men emerged. They seemed to be in good spirits, but requested water and firewood. They didn't speak Japanese, and all communication had to be done through gestures. The samurai explained that they had to leave. They explained that if the men didn't leave, they would fire cannonballs at the vessel. The samurai would have to resort to violence, opening fire when the men still didn't leave. Whether or not anybody was hit was unclear, but the foreign sailors did eventually flee the scene. The only hint at the ship's identity was the fact that it appeared to be British, something that angered the samurai commander. For almost 200 years, the identity of the ship had remained a mystery. It was a mystery that Nick wanted to get to the bottom of. Working with a group that translated manuscripts, he collected all the available details from the samurai account. He believed it was a whaling vessel, as a few details seemed to line up, but others pointed to a different origin. It occurred to Nick that the ship may have been the subject of a mutiny, and he used Google to search for the 1829 mutiny. This time, he found information on the brig Cyprus. Cyprus was a British ship that worked off the coast of Australia. In 1829, he was transporting convicts to the Macquarie Harbour Penal Station when a group of prisoners rebelled and seized the vessel. Anybody who wasn't in the mutiny was forced off the ship, and the convicts sailed away. William Swallow was the only person with sailing experience and became the man in charge. He took the ship through islands in the Pacific, where a few men were dropped off, and then headed north. The Cyprus was eventually scuttled in China, where the remaining sailors claimed they were castaways from another ship. They were sent back to England, but on the way, one of the men who'd been left behind confessed. News was sent to London, and the Cyprus survivors were arrested. At his trial, Swallow claimed that he had visited Japan, a story that was considered ridiculous at the time. For years, it was considered nothing more than a fabrication, until the samurai account was connected to the Cyprus. The confession made by 45-year-old Brian Hawkins might just be one of the most sensational admissions ever by a criminal, since he chose to do so in front of television cameras in 2018. On the 9th of January that year, Hawkins traveled to KRCR news station in Redding, California, where he told the producers of the station that he wanted to go on camera to make a confession. He was allowed to do so, and as the interview started, he stated he'd been living a walking nightmare for the past 21 years due to a crime he committed in 1993, and that finally he needed to come clean. The case in question started in May of 1993 when 19-year-old Frank Wesley McAllister inexplicably disappeared from Shingletown in California, and for more than a year, he could not be located, and investigators were baffled until they were contacted by a member of the public. A hiker who'd been out in the woods in Shingleton reported that he found human remains while on his hike, and they were eventually identified as Frank's. The police announced that his case had been upgraded to a homicide, but with no evidence in the case, no suspects were identified. In the years that followed, Hawkins struggled to deal with the guilt over the crime that he'd committed, and he would later state that he'd found God and realized that he needed to confess to what he had done. He felt that this was the closest he would ever come to making things right, and so he chose to confess on camera. He stated that in 1993, he, Shanna Culver, and her brother, Curtis Culver, had befriended Frank, but under false pretenses. The three accomplices were all addicted to illegal substances, and with very little funds, they needed to make a plan. They decided to lure Frank into a rural area where they planned to rob him of the cash and valuables that he had on him. But the attack became more frenzied than they had anticipated, and at one point they produced blades, which they used to end Frank's life. They left his remains in the woods and fled. Investigators were told that Frank was last seen in the trio's company, but they denied the attack on him, and with no evidence to link them to the crime, they could not be taken into custody. But the events of that day stuck with Hawkins, and on several occasions he wanted to travel to Frank's family's house to confess. But by the time he'd gathered the courage to do so, Frank's father had passed away, and so he decided not to go through with his plan. He added that he knew he and his accomplices had robbed Frank of the life he deserved, but added that he himself had not much of a life since he had to deal with the guilt of what he had done on a daily basis. Christine Robinson was a bright and outgoing school teacher who was viciously attacked at her game lodge in South Africa in 2014. It would take the online sleuthing efforts of her niece, living on another continent, to finally solve her case almost a decade later. Christine was a British schoolteacher who traveled around the world as part of her career. She had taught in Moscow and Kuwait, among other places. When she married a retired RAF pilot in her 40s, she settled down in South Africa. The couple owned a game lodge, which Christine continued to run after her husband passed away. Christine was in the process of selling the business in 2014. She had a meeting about the sale on July 30th but failed to make it. Visitors to the lodge soon found out why. Her body was found wrapped in a duvet with obvious signs of trauma. As Christine's family in the UK was contacted, the lodge staff were gathered to inform them of Christine's attack. One person was missing though, a gardener named Andrea Imbayaro. The police soon learned that the co-worker had given Imbayaro a lift to the Zimbabwean border. According to the co-worker, Imbayaro had been on the phone during the drive and confessed to taking the life of a white woman. The Zimbabwe native soon became the police's prime suspect, but extraditing him from Zimbabwe proved difficult. In the UK, Christine's niece, Leanne, waited for justice. She'd been close to her aunt, talking with her every week on the phone and sharing countless email conversations. Through those emails, Christine had talked about many of her staff members, but Imbayaro was never mentioned. The case dragged on and went cold. Leanne decided to take on the investigation herself. She found Imbayaro was using social media under a different name and had moved back to South Africa. He'd even signed up for dating apps. She connected with him via these apps using a fake name. She pretended she was an air stewardess, giving herself an excuse as to why she may not always be contactable, but flattered him and managed to keep his attention. At one point, Leanne managed to set up a fake date and got the police in South Africa involved to try to set up a sting operation. For some reason, the operation fell through, and Imbayaro stopped contacting Leanne. Even though her initial internet crime solving didn't pan out, Leanne continued to try to get justice for her aunt. The UK Foreign Office had encouraged her not to post online about the case, but after years of no progress, she made a Facebook post sharing Imbayaro's name and photo and accusing him of taking Christine's life. The social media post went viral and was shared by a crime activist working with Action Society in South Africa. It was exactly the push Christine's case needed. A woman in South Africa recognized Imbayaro's photo. He'd been working for her and lived on her property. The woman contacted Action Society, who worked with the police to finally apprehend the criminal. He would be found guilty at a trial in 2022 and given 2 life sentences for the crime. But according to Leanne, he could be up for parole after as little as 22 years. In March of 1998, 63-year-old Mohammed Taki, who originally hailed from Iraq, was living in Fulham, England after having immigrated there. He would have regular doctor's appointments, but was last seen by his doctor on the 12th of January, and he never returned, which struck the doctor as strange. Mohammed was employed at the time, so when he failed to make contact with any of his friends or family, they became concerned for his well-being and contacted the police to report him as missing. Investigators traveled to his apartment in Whittingstall Road, but could not locate him, and so they started searching for him in the city, but with no luck. Mohammed's family only grew more worried as months passed by without any word from him, and with no progress being made in his case. Mohammed was known to be a very small man, and given his age, he would have been an easy target for criminals in the area. There were real fears that he'd been attacked, robbed, or abducted, but these theories could not be proven due to a lack of evidence. For more than a decade, nothing further was found, and it was assumed that Mohammed was no longer alive. Those assumptions were found to be true when the police in Fulham received a tip from a member of the public who stated that they should search the apartment of a man named Roy Heath. Heath was known to have connections to the criminal underground of the city, since he'd been seen in the company of 2 notorious gangsters, the Cray twins. He was sent to prison for an unrelated crime, and while incarcerated, he and Reggie Cray became friends and were seen in each other's company after serving their respective sentences. The police traveled to Heath's apartment, which was situated on Alderville Road, on the 10th of January 2010, and a search was started. The inside of the apartment showed no signs of a crime having been committed, but under Heath's patio, they found a few plastic bags, bedding, and carpet. When they were searched, they found a set of remains, and then started the unenviable task of identifying them. Thanks to the tip that had been received, it was assumed that they belonged to Mohammed. But to be sure, investigators searched for his family members to obtain DNA samples. They traced one of his sisters to Baghdad, and she provided a sample, but testing proved to be inconclusive. They then obtained Mohammed's medical files from his doctor, and they showed that he was suffering from a spinal condition before he vanished. The remains that were unearthed were compared to Mohammed's medical file, and at last it was confirmed that the remains were indeed his. One of his friends also confirmed that a hat found at the scene belonged to the missing man. Heath was now the main suspect, but investigators soon learned that he was suffering from cancer and had been admitted to a hospice in Lambeth, South London. At first, he denied any involvement when he was questioned, but just 13 days before he passed away, he finally confessed. In 2022, something as simple as a Google alert helped solve the mystery of a painting that had been missing for over 30 years. In 1991, staff at the Museum of Cider in Hereford, England, noticed something was missing from one of its walls. The museum celebrated the history of cider and apples and displayed many pieces of art to help tell that story. One of these was Henry Bryan Ziegler's The Cider Mill, a painting they'd acquired in the 1980s with the help of a grant. An opportunistic visitor had come into the museum and simply taken the painting from the wall, then walked out with it. The police investigation into the theft started straight away, and the museum reported the disappearance to art crime registers. But despite this, there was no trace of the missing painting. When director Elizabeth Pimblett started working at the museum in 2016, she became fascinated by the cider mill. The painting still hadn't been recovered, but the Museum of Cider displayed a photograph of the artwork. She liked the painting so much that she made it the background image on her computer and was determined to bring it back into the museum's collection. In the 27 years since it had vanished, there had been no updates in the case. But as so much time had passed, Elizabeth thought that it was possible the painting might be put up for sale again soon. If the artwork had been stolen for a personal collection, there was a chance the original thieves had passed on, and the people who inherited it might not know they were dealing with stolen property. It was also possible the original thieves would simply tire of the artwork or find themselves in need of money, and they could sell it in the belief that no one would be looking for it anymore. Elizabeth set up a Google alert, which would email her whenever there was an auction that included the word cider in the description. Unsurprisingly, that led to a lot of emails, most of which had nothing to do with the missing painting. But in May of 2022, Elizabeth received an email that looked promising. While many other emails had gone unread, she decided this one needed to be looked into further. After clicking through to the auction website, she was greeted by the same image she had as her computer background. The auction was set to begin in 2 weeks, so Elizabeth worked quickly, contacting the police to bring back the stolen artwork. The Museum of Cider still had all the paperwork proving they were the rightful owners of the cider mill, and the painting was eventually returned. The painting didn't seem to be too damaged, but it needed some conservation work before it could be displayed again. It's now on display behind reinforced glass and is protected by an alarm system. There's no doubt that gang violence was a very serious issue in the US during the 90s, and one complicated case from 1994 turned into a miscarriage of justice as a result. The Bloods and Crips gangs have been rivals for a very long time, and it's only in modern times that some of their chapters have called for a truce. In other parts of the country, they still proved to be problematic, and in 1994, this was a real concern. On the 10th of September that year, 19-year-old Karen LaShawn Summers was attending a house party in Tulsa, Oklahoma, when a group of gang members committed a drive-by attack with firearms. Witnesses would later state that she had just arrived at the house, which was filled with members of the Crips gang, and at around 2:45 a.m., members of their rival gang attacked from a maroon-colored sedan, hitting Karen and ending her life. DeMarco Carpenter and Malcolm Scott were known to the police by this point, since they were both members of the Bloods gang. A year earlier, they were both wounded along with 7 other people when someone from a rival gang started firing at the bar they were in. A man called Michael Wilson was found in possession of the same type of firearm that was used in the attack while sitting in a maroon-colored car, and he was brought in for questioning, but released again soon after. This would prove to be a fatal error as he attacked and ended the life of 30-year-old Richard Yost, who was his co-worker, with a baseball bat just a few months later. He was arrested, tried, and sentenced to be executed. In the meantime, the investigation into Karen's case continued, and Carpenter was named as a suspect along with Scott, despite there being very little evidence that they were involved. Rashawn Williams and Kenneth Price, who also attended the party, came forward as witnesses and confirmed that Carpenter and Scott were the attackers that night. They were arrested and told by investigators that they should testify against each other, but they refused to do so, claiming that they were innocent. Their trials went ahead, and they were each sentenced to life in prison with an added 175 years tacked on. They reached out to private investigator Eric Cullen, who noticed some discrepancies in the initial investigation. He and the Innocence Project started working the case from scratch and soon became convinced that Carpenter and Scott were indeed innocent. Despite their inquiries, it came to light that Wilson, who was on death row, was willing to admit his involvement in the attack, but his attorneys dissuaded him from doing so until he had depleted his appeals against his sentence. His execution was set for the 9th of January 2014, by which time Carpenter and Scott had been incarcerated for 2 decades. But just 2 days before that date, he made a recording in which he confessed to being the one who opened fire at the party attendees that night. Social media has been used to help solve many crimes. Thefts are some of the most common crimes to be talked about online, with stores and individuals sharing CCTV footage in the hopes of catching the perpetrators. Too often, these images aren't necessarily clear enough to get a good picture of the culprit, and thefts are notoriously likely to go unsolved in many places. One store in Alabama seems to have cracked the code of using social media to bring thieves to justice. On September 16, 2025, a group of people entered the B&B Pet Stop in Mobile, Alabama. The group wandered through the aisles for about 10 minutes. During that time, they placed 2 grab-and-go tarantula kits into their shopping cart. When the store got busy at the tills, one of the group distracted a worker, while the rest walked out of the building, the tarantula kits still in the cart. The kits had everything needed to take care of the spider, including the red-rumped tarantula itself. After realizing what had happened, B&B's owner, Bill Trufant, checked the store's CCTV cameras and found clear footage of the individuals. The next day, the pictures were posted on the store's Facebook page, along with the caption explaining the situation, saying, quote, "Can anyone help us? We want to know who they are so we can let the police know. This makes me so mad. We're trying to run a friendly neighborhood pet store, and when folks don't pay for merchandise, it makes it really hard." The post attracted almost 200 comments and was shared over 900 times. Almost 250,000 people saw the post on the first day that it was posted. Many of the comments offered support for the store, and a handful were able to identify the 2 women in the images. They were Raja and Talagia Johnson. They were both accused of organized retail theft, and for Raja, it was her 4th arrest. In this case, the spiders were quickly returned to the store. Less than 24 hours after the theft, a man was spotted on CCTV, leaving boxes containing the spiders outside the store. His face was covered, and it's not known if he was one of the men who initially stole the animals, but the tarantulas were unharmed. What made this theft so remarkable was that it wasn't the first time animals had been stolen from B&B's pet shop, and it wasn't the first time social media was used to find the people responsible. In 2023, B&B made a Facebook post about a woman who'd come into the store with her children. She'd taken a ferret into the store's bathroom and left with the animal concealed. The woman was tracked down in Mississippi. A Facebook user claiming to be the thief commented on the social media post, claiming that it had been a misunderstanding. For reasons unknown, though, the ferret was never returned. On the 20th of November, 1975, the body of 26-year-old Joanne Harrison was found in a garage that stood empty for some time in Berwick Road in Avenham, England. It was determined she'd been badly beaten, and that during the assault, her attacker had bitten her. It was also discovered that her 2 gold wedding rings from her 2 marriages were missing, and so it was suggested that her life was ended during a robbery that went wrong. Her friends and family were interviewed, and it was discovered that 2 nights before her life was ended, Joanne had traveled to Preston from her house in Deepdale, stating that she was going out for a few drinks. While the theory of robbery was still very much an option, it was soon speculated that Joanne might be a victim of Peter Sutcliffe, better known as the Yorkshire Ripper, a serial killer who was thought to have sent a series of letters to the police in 1978, 3 years after Joanne was attacked. One of these letters stated that the police had erroneously attributed 7 attacks to Sutcliffe, but that in reality he had 8 victims, the missing one being a case from Preston who was attacked in 1975. The letters were found to have been written by John Humble, also known as Wareside Jack, but they were a hoax. He was eventually sentenced to 8 years in prison for perverting the course of justice. After Sutcliffe was tracked down and arrested in 1981, he revealed that Joanne was not one of his victims, and investigators were left back at square one. Nevertheless, the investigation remained open, and DNA that was collected from the garage was routinely sent for analysis, but to no avail. The DNA in question was collected from the bite mark on Joanne's body, and investigators hoped that it would only be a matter of time before it would lead them to the culprit. In 2008, they would finally find out who was responsible, but it was already too late to take the attacker into custody. That year, 60-year-old Christopher Smith, who hailed from Leeds, was stopped by the police and arrested for driving while under the influence of alcohol. As is customary, his DNA was collected and added to the national database, and this likely urged him to confess. By this time, Smith's health was already failing due to a terminal illness, and 6 days after he was arrested, he passed away. When his DNA came back as a match for that collected from Joanne's remains, his house was searched. Investigators found a note that he penned just 1 day before he passed away, and in it, he stated he'd been living in guilt ever since the night that he ended Joanne's life, and that he needed to come clean. In 2020, Michael Rainsford, a 20-year-old skateboarder with no gang ties, was fatally wounded while in his kitchen in Merseyside, England, an apparent random attack. Neighbors saw the culprits flee on an orange electric bike, which police traced via CCTV to an address in Seaforth, linking the crime to brothers Mitchell and James Foy. Less than an hour earlier, the Foys, who were involved with the local gang, had their home window broken by a brick, which they believed was the work of a rival gang, the Kirkstone Riot Squad, or KRS. Seeking revenge, the brothers entered KRS territory, where the Rainsford family lived. On the way, James Foy posted a menacing Snapchat video showing the orange electric bike, captioned, "Tell your ma, duck don't use bricks," with bang emojis. The Rainsford home was likely targeted in a case of mistaken identity. Despite the Foys trying to dispose of their phones and family members attempting a cover-up, cell phone data and CCTV placed them at the scene. Crucially, a contact accidentally saved James Foy's incriminating Snapchat story, which became a key piece of evidence alongside WhatsApp messages. Both brothers were found guilty of murder and sentenced to life in prison. 3 others received sentences for covering up the crime. In 2002, the police in Florida had very few leads to follow in the case of 70-year-old Richard Busey, whose life had been ended by an unknown attacker, and for 14 years they would find very few answers. After not seeing Richard for a few days, something that was very out of character for him, one of his friends decided to check on him and went over to his house. To his horror, the friend discovered Richard deceased on the living room floor of his apartment, which was located at 3000 Northeast 5th Terrace in Wilton Manors. He'd been covered with a blanket, and the friend immediately notified the authorities. When the scene was processed, it was found that Richard had been badly assaulted, to the point where he lost his life. Residents in the area at the time reported seeing a man named Josh, who they assumed was homeless, hanging around in the neighborhood, though there was no way of proving that he was the one who carried out the attack. Nevertheless, investigators released the description that had been given and informed the public that he was in his 20s, with long blonde hair. A composite sketch of the man was created and circulated, but no one came forward with any new information, and before long, Richard's case went cold. The fingerprints and DNA that were collected from the apartment could not be matched to anyone in their respective databases, but they were preserved so that they could be resubmitted when the case was eventually revisited. In 2002, the police received an anonymous tip from someone who claimed to have seen Josh in Richard's apartment on the night of the attack. They added that he had a large tattoo on his chest, but despite this new lead, the man could not be tracked down. Then, in October of 2016, the case was finally and unexpectedly solved. A 38-year-old man named Joshua Odom walked into the police station in Iowa and asked to speak to investigators, and he then proceeded to confess to ending Richard's life in 2002. Odom stated that at the time he was 24 years old and homeless. He was also addicted to illegal substances, and so when Richard invited him up to his apartment for a few drinks, he saw it as the perfect opportunity to get his hands on some money. Once inside the apartment, he started assaulting 70-year-old Richard and ended his life before covering his body with a blanket and stealing items that he then later sold for money to buy more of the illegal substance. Before traveling to the police station, Odom was living at the Bethel Mission homeless shelter in Des Moines, and while there, he says he was told by God to make things right by confessing to the crime that he had committed. But the fact that he'd confessed did not necessarily mean that he was the culprit. First, investigators needed to compare Odom's statements to the evidence that was found. He stated that he strangled Richard, and once he was unconscious, he hit him over the head with a vase. This matched with what was found at the scene, and when Odom's fingerprints and DNA came back as a positive match to the evidence found in Richard's apartment, he was arrested. The story of Garage: Bad Dream Adventure sounds more like a gaming urban legend than a real video game. The Japanese title was filled with surreal and horrifying images and couldn't be found anywhere online. The dedicated effort of a niche online audience made sure this mysterious game didn't remain lost media and brought Garage to the wider world. Discussions about Garage have been happening on 4chan for a while before 2017. Given the nature of the website, it isn't unheard of for video game hoaxes to originate on the forums, and to some outsiders, it seemed like Garage: Bad Dream Adventure might be one of those hoaxes. It was allegedly created in 1999 by Tomone Sakuba, a Japanese artist. Only around 3,000 copies had been produced, and it had never been released outside Japan. There was no English translation, or any translation into any other language, making it difficult to determine the storyline. Only a few images of the game seemed to exist online, which only made people even more intrigued. But the fact that little footage was found made some doubt that it was even real. But Garage was real. Investigators were able to talk to people who'd been involved in the creation of the game, confirming its existence. Unfortunately, they didn't have the game or access to any of the files after the company that produced it shut down. Japan has strict anti-piracy laws, so even if anybody did happen to have a copy of this, it would be extremely rare and 20 years old, and they'd risk falling foul of those anti-piracy laws by posting it online. Occasionally, copies of the game would appear on online auction sites, but they often went for thousands of yen and were far beyond the reach of most online gamers who wanted a glimpse of the enigmatic game. Finally, in 2014, a user on the HG101 board purchased a copy of the game for 77,000 yen and shipped it to the US and then to Australia, and once he finally had his hands on the game, he uploaded it online. Garage still remained mysterious. The game had allegedly been inspired by a dream Sakuba had, and that the surreal, dreamlike nature carried through to the dialogue. Most of the characters didn't talk in a straightforward manner, more closely resembling the winding narratives of a bizarre dream than something that would actually be happening in waking life. On top of that, it was still entirely in Japanese, adding another layer to obscure the meaning of the title. By this point, though, Sakuba had learned of the work online for the wider world to get a hold of his game. Producing only limited copies hadn't been his original intention, and he was happy to see that others wanted to share the piece of art. He began working with a new team of developers to recreate Garage. As they didn't have the original files, they were working from scratch to recreate the experience Sakuba had first created in 1999. In 2021, the new version of Garage was released on Google Play and the App Store, finally allowing the international audience to experience the game in its entirety. On the 31st of August, 1994, investigators in Kelso, Washington were confronted with a case that they just could not solve, despite their best efforts. For decades, they kept revisiting the facts of the case, but with no new information on who'd committed the crime, it seemed as though the culprit would never be caught. It started when the police were called to Douglas Street, when residents of the 400 block found an unresponsive man in a trailer that was parked in front of a house. Investigators rushed to the scene where they found a man named by sources as Busey, deceased and covered with several blankets. An autopsy revealed that Busey had been assaulted with a blade, and that the culprit had carried out a frenzied attack before making a clean getaway. No one in the area had seen or heard anything untoward, and so there were no witnesses to the crime. It was also estimated that Busey had lost his life about 4 days before he was found, and by that time, his attacker had likely fled the area to evade the law. Further investigation revealed that his car, a 1984 Ford Thunderbird, had been stolen, and a search for the vehicle was launched. It was eventually discovered abandoned at the Portland Meadows racecourse, and it was determined that it had been in an accident. The police also found biological material in the trunk, and noticed that one of the front tires was flat as a result of an incident. Several lines of inquiry were followed, but with no witnesses to question and no further evidence found, the case eventually went cold. It seemed as though someone had carried out a crime of opportunity, and that they had gotten away with it. For the next 22 years, the case was reviewed from time to time, but no new clues were ever discovered, and no progress was made. In the end, all investigators needed to do was wait, since in 2016 they finally got the answers they were looking for. A man named Brandon David Wright walked into a police station in Salt Lake City and stated that he needed to make a confession, which immediately got the attention of officers. He was taken to an interview room where his statement was recorded. Wright stated that at the time of the attack, he was heavily addicted to illegal substances, and on the night in question, he didn't have any money to support his habit. He decided to commit a burglary, and when he saw the trailer parked in the street, he assumed it would be an easy target. He believed the trailer belonged to a man named Bob, who wasn't there at the time, and so he had no issues breaking in. But while he was searching for valuables to steal, he was surprised by Busey, who'd seen the strange activity in the trailer, and a scuffle ensued. Wright grabbed a hammer and attacked Busey before ending his life with a blade. Wright was arrested and sentenced to 17 years in prison, despite his family pleading to the court to reduce his sentence to just 12. Amelia Ignasio was a kind and intelligent young woman and the mother of 2 children when she had her life violently taken from her in April of 2014. Her daughter, Kiani De Jesus, was only 11 years old at the time. Kiani spent the next 10 years looking for justice and used social media to make that happen. Amelia was 28 years old at the time of the crime. She was set to graduate from the University of Maryland in May with a degree in legal studies. Her friends and family knew her as a caring young woman who wanted to help out others. Her goals were to become a lawyer and help the immigrant community. About 4 years earlier, she'd begun dating Juan Miguel Roman. From the outside, it looked as if they had a good relationship. According to family members, there were no signs of violence, but Kiani told a different story. He was violent towards Amelia, even when she was pregnant with their son. When she managed to break up with Roman, Kiani saw a change in her mother. She was more confident and outgoing again. Unfortunately, Roman couldn't be kept away for long. In initial news reports on the case, it was claimed that the couple had reconciled and had actually gone on a date on the night of the attack. According to Kiani, Roman had lured Amelia into going to dinner with him. She didn't return home that night, something that was very out of character for her. Over the next week, loved ones began searching for Amelia. It was unthinkable that she might have decided to disappear of her own free will. She was a hardworking and dedicated mother. Fellow students said Amelia told them she missed her children, even when she was out studying for a short time. After a week of searching, Amelia's body was found in her car, parked not far from her home. She'd been struck by a bladed object multiple times, and it seemed the crime had taken place the very night that Amelia had disappeared. Nobody had been able to get in touch with Roman since Amelia vanished, and he quickly became the prime suspect. They soon discovered that he'd already booked tickets to Mexico before the attack. If Roman was the person responsible, it was clearly a premeditated crime. To Amelia's family's frustration, once Roman was in Mexico, he seemingly disappeared. There was little the police could do to bring him back, and the investigation into the case became incredibly difficult. There were no other suspects, and the case quickly went cold. Kiani grew frustrated about the lack of action in her mother's case, and scared about what Roman might do to her or some other women. Along with a cousin, she started a campaign on social media to bring Ramon to justice. She posted about her mother's case online, making sure that people knew that she was beyond a victim of a violent crime. She described the hard work her mother had done to ensure Kiani had a good life and her plans for the future. In December of 2023, someone in Mexico contacted Kiani on Instagram. She'd seen the video and recognized Ramon, who was now going by the name Pablo. Kiani contacted the police, and within 3 weeks of receiving the message, the authorities in Mexico had arrested Ramon. What followed was a long extradition process to bring Ramon to the US to face trial. He finally arrived in late 2025, and his trial is set to begin in February 2026. Before the start of the case involving 23-year-old Loretta Jones began, the single mother of a 4-year-old girl was having a tough time. In 1970, she was living in Price, Utah, and according to those who knew Loretta, her surrounding community found it hard to accept that she wasn't married, and hence they looked down on her. But at the time, she was trying to make a better life for herself and her daughter, Heidi. She'd enrolled in accounting night classes, and during the day she was holding down a full-time job. According to those who knew her, she and Heidi were extremely close, and they did everything together. But on the 31st of July that year, their bond would be broken in the worst way possible. That morning, Heidi woke up and heard that something strange and terrifying was going on in their house's living room. She instantly became afraid and luckily decided not to open her bedroom door, but instead she peeked through the keyhole to see what was happening. To her dismay, she saw Loretta lying on the floor, and she ran outside for help. She came across a boy who lived in the neighborhood, and after first going back to the house, they ran to his house to inform his mother. She called the police, who, upon arriving at Loretta's house, determined that she'd been badly assaulted, and she was no longer alive. No signs of forced entry were found, and it was suggested that Loretta knew her attacker and had likely let them into the house. Her assailant had then attacked her with a small blade before fleeing, but not before leaving his DNA behind at the scene. But this was not the only incident in the neighborhood that morning. Later that same day, investigators returned to the area after it was reported that someone had attempted to kidnap a girl who was playing outside of her house. She later told the police that the man who tried to kidnap her was wearing a strange yellow hat, and that after he grabbed her, she started to scream, and the man dropped her before fleeing the area on foot. Heidi was placed in the care of her grandparents, who later contacted investigators to report that Heidi kept saying that a man named Tom had attacked Loretta. It was known that she at one point had dated a man named Thomas Edward Egley. He was questioned, but stated that he was in a bar at the time of the attack. A bartender would confirm seeing Egley in the bar, but added that he saw strange red stains on Egley's shirt while he was there. He was arrested, but at a preliminary trial, the judge deemed the evidence against him to be circumstantial, and the charges against Egley were dropped. It was only in 2009 that the case saw new life when Heidi ran into Sergeant David Brewer from the Carbon County Sheriff's Office, who she knew from high school. He started investigating Loretta's case anew, and he discovered that Egley had burned some of his clothing on the night of the attack. One of his ex-girlfriends agreed to wear a wire while questioning Egley about the case, and while doing so, Egley confessed to ending Loretta's life. He was arrested once again, and this time, justice was served as he was handed a sentence of 10 years behind bars. Thank you guys so much for watching. If you liked this video, be sure to hit that like button. Also, don't forget to subscribe and click that notification bell to keep up to date with all of our future uploads. But my name is Ty Knotts, and I'll catch you guys in the next one.